In 1996, 52 million people watched Matthew Perry and Julia Roberts flirt on the Friends Super Bowl episode, completely unaware of the intense real-life romance blooming behind the cameras. It began with a bizarre demand for a quantum physics paper, evolving into a deeply intimate, secret love story hidden via fax machines. But while the world saw a perfect Hollywood fairy tale, television's funniest man was secretly drowning in a severe Vicodin addiction and crippling imposter syndrome. This is the devastating true story of why Matthew Perry deliberately sabotaged the greatest romance of his life. The blueprint for that sabotage was drawn long before the cameras ever rolled, hidden deep within the fractured psychological architecture of the two people involved. Long before they collided on a sound stage in Burbank, California, both Matthew Perry and Julia Roberts had been fundamentally shaped by different, yet equally isolating, forms of trauma. For Matthew Perry, the root of his profound insecurity was established decades earlier in Ottawa, Canada. He was the child of a fractured marriage, his parents having separated before he was even a year old. His mother was a high-powered press secretary to the Canadian Prime Minister, frequently consumed by the immense demands of national politics. His father was an actor, living thousands of miles away in California. Perry spent his childhood shuttling between these two distinct worlds, frequently flying as an unaccompanied minor. A child flying alone learns a terrifying silent lesson about abandonment. The people who are supposed to protect you are not always there, and survival depends entirely on your ability to manage your own anxiety. To bridge the gap between his absent father and his stressed mother, Perry developed a highly specific defense mechanism. He became funny. He learned that if he could manufacture a joke, if he could expertly break the tension in a room, he could secure a temporary fragile moment of affection. Comedy was not a hobby. It was a desperate survival strategy. He subconsciously wired his brain to believe that he was fundamentally unlovable unless he was performing. By the time he reached his 20s and secured the role of Chandler Bing on Friends, this childhood coping mechanism had hardened into a severe case of imposter syndrome. He was starring on the most popular television program in America, but internally, he remained the frightened, unaccompanied minor, constantly terrified that the adults in the room were going to realize he did not belong there and send him away. To quiet the deafening noise of this insecurity, he had already begun experimenting with alcohol and prescription painkillers, laying the groundwork for a catastrophic chemical dependency. Julia Roberts carried a different, yet equally crushing psychological burden. Born in Smyrna, Georgia, she had not been groomed for the Hollywood machine from birth. Her ascent to global superstardom was abrupt, violent, and unprecedented. In 1990, the release of Pretty Woman did not just make her famous. It transformed her into a highly lucrative piece of public property. Overnight, she became the undisputed queen of the box office. But the early 1990s was a notoriously predatory era for female celebrities. The tabloid culture was aggressive, unregulated, and deeply misogynistic. Every romantic relationship she engaged in, from Kiefer Sutherland to Jason Patrick, was hunted, dissected, and heavily scrutinized by a ravenous paparazzi apparatus. Roberts found herself trapped at the absolute pinnacle of the Hollywood caste system. She possessed immense wealth, global adoration, and unprecedented industry power, but the isolation was absolute. The industry is inherently transactional. When a woman commands $20 million a film, it becomes nearly impossible for her to discern who is interacting with her out of genuine affection and who is merely trying to extract proximity to her power. Leading men in Hollywood often possessed massive, fragile egos that were deeply threatened by her superior box office status. By 1995, Roberts was exhausted by the superficiality of Los Angeles. She was fiercely intelligent, protective of her boundaries, and actively searching for an intellectual equal, someone who could engage her mind without being intimidated by her fame. These two highly guarded, fundamentally isolated individuals were on a direct collision course, completely unaware that a corporate television mandate was about to force their paths to cross. In late 1995, the executive board at NBC made a monumental programming decision. They awarded the post-Super Bowl broadcast slot to Friends. In the economics of 1990s network television, the Super Bowl lead-out was the Holy Grail. It was an opportunity to broadcast a single episode to an audience of over 40 million people. It was a billion-dollar gamble designed to lock in the show's syndication dominance for the next 20 years. But the network was not going to rely solely on the strength of their 6 core cast members. They issued a strict mandate to the show's creators. They required a roster of A-list guest stars to guarantee a ratings explosion. The producers immediately targeted Julia Roberts. Securing her would be a massive historic coup. At the time, an unspoken rigid hierarchy divided the entertainment industry. Movie stars did not do television. Television was viewed as a lower-tier medium, a stepping stone for actors trying to break into film, or a graveyard for those whose cinematic careers had failed. For the biggest movie star on the planet to appear on a 30-minute sitcom was practically unheard of. When the producers reached out to Roberts' representation with the offer, they expected a polite refusal. Instead, Roberts, who was filming a movie in Europe at the time, reviewed the request. She was aware of the cultural phenomenon of Friends, and she was specifically aware of Matthew Perry's character, Chandler Bing. She recognized that the rapid-fire, sarcastic dialogue delivered by Perry required a sharp, highly functioning intellect. It was exactly the type of wit she found compelling. Roberts did not issue a flat refusal, nor did she passively accept the offer. She executed a brilliant, highly calculated power play. She informed the producers that she would agree to the cameo, but she set a strict, non-negotiable condition. Her character was not to interact with the entire ensemble. She demanded that her storyline be exclusively tied to Chandler Bing. When the producers relayed this information to Perry, he was elated, but his excitement was immediately followed by a wave of intense anxiety. Roberts had not simply agreed to show up, she had issued a direct challenge. She informed the network that before she would sign the final contract, Matthew Perry had to personally write and send her an academic paper explaining the principles of quantum physics. To a layman, this demand might appear as the erratic behavior of an entitled Hollywood diva, but it was entirely the opposite. It was a sophisticated psychological test. Roberts was setting a boundary. She was testing Perry's intellect, his willingness to work for her respect, and his ability to handle her dominant status without his ego collapsing. She wanted to know if the man behind the television character was genuinely intelligent or if he was just another Hollywood actor reciting lines written by someone else. Perry, already battling his deeply ingrained imposter syndrome, panicked. He was a comedic actor, not a theoretical physicist. The prospect of writing a complex scientific paper for the most intimidating woman in the world triggered his deepest fears of inadequacy. But the stakes were too high. The entire network, the producers and his fellow cast members, were relying on him to secure her contract. He did not face this intellectual hurdle alone. The Friends production offices immediately transformed into a makeshift academic research center. The show's brilliant writing staff, recognizing the immense corporate value of securing Julia Roberts, rallied around Perry. Together, they spent days researching quantum mechanics, drafting and redrafting the paper. The goal was to ensure the document was scientifically accurate enough to pass her test, but infused with enough of Perry's trademark, self-deprecating humor to prove he was not taking himself too seriously. It was a bizarre, unprecedented scenario. A massive multinational television corporation had accidentally facilitated a highly specific intellectual courtship ritual. A casting stunt designed solely to generate advertising revenue had inadvertently ignited a deeply personal pursuit between two people searching for genuine connection. When the paper was finally completed, Perry stood in the production office, staring at a standard fax machine. He fed the document into the machine, dialed the international number for her location in France, and listened to the electronic screech as the paper was transmitted across the Atlantic Ocean. He had completed the task. He had exposed a piece of himself to the biggest star in the world. Now trapped in his own insecurity on a studio lot in California, the unaccompanied minor could do nothing but wait in the silence to see if she would accept him or abandon him entirely. The fax machine in the Warner Brothers production office finally whirred to life. The response from France had arrived. Julia Roberts did not simply acknowledge the quantum physics paper. She engaged with it. She fired back a witty, intelligent response, validating Perry's effort and officially confirming her appearance on the Super Bowl episode. But the communication did not stop with the signing of a television contract. The corporate mandate had effectively been fulfilled, yet the machines kept running. What began as a Hollywood casting stunt rapidly evolved into a prolific, intensely private, transatlantic courtship. To comprehend the depth of their connection, one must understand the unique geography of their isolation. In late 1995, Julia Roberts was in Europe, entirely enveloped in the high-pressure apparatus of international filmmaking. She was existing at a level of fame that fundamentally distorted human interaction. When a woman is universally branded as the most beautiful in the world, people cease to speak to her. They speak to her status. They agree with her unconditionally. They laugh at jokes that are not funny. She was starved for friction. She was actively seeking a peer who would challenge her, someone who possessed the intellectual confidence to engage her mind without collapsing under the weight of her box office gross. Thousands of miles away in Los Angeles, Matthew Perry was experiencing his own highly specific form of isolation. He was physically surrounded by the massive, frantic energy of a hit television show, constantly attended to by wardrobe assistants, publicists, and executives. Yet internally he was entirely alone, trapped inside the exhausting mechanics of his own insecurity. He was a man who desperately needed to prove his worth through comedy, terrified that if the jokes stopped, his value as a human being would instantly evaporate. For these two highly guarded individuals, the outdated technology of the standard office fax machine provided a perfect, sterile sanctuary. It removed the terrifying variables of physical proximity. For Perry, the fax machine acted as a vital psychological shield. It offered him a buffer. He did not have to worry about a stutter, an awkward pause, or the physical panic of standing next to a cinematic icon. He had the time to draft, edit, and perfect his responses. He could present a flawless, highly curated version of his intellect. For Roberts, the medium stripped away the sycophantic noise of Hollywood. There were no publicists mediating the conversation, no paparazzi hiding in the bushes. It was just text on paper. Over the course of several weeks, they sent hundreds of faxes across the Atlantic. The content quickly bypassed superficial industry gossip. They engaged in a profound intellectual striptease. They debated philosophy, dissected literature, and exchanged poetry. Perry would attend lavish, overcrowded Hollywood parties, the exact environments designed to celebrate his new television fame, and find himself completely detached from the room. He would actively seek out a quiet, empty back office, sit down next to a telecommunications machine, and wait for a piece of paper to slowly print from Paris. He was falling in love with her intellect, and she was falling in love with his unvarnished vulnerability. Roberts found a man who was not trying to leverage her fame, but who was simply trying to make her laugh. By the time Roberts completed her filming in Europe and boarded a flight back to Los Angeles, the intellectual foundation of a serious romantic relationship had been firmly established. They had exposed their minds to each other. Now they had to expose their physical realities. When Julia Roberts arrived on stage 24 at the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank, the sterile safety of the fax machine was instantly shattered. The intellectual intimacy they had constructed over thousands of miles violently collided with the chaotic, highly scrutinized environment of a television set. The stakes for the production were astronomical. The NBC network had invested millions of dollars in the post-Super Bowl broadcast, and the executives were heavily monitoring the set. But for Perry and Roberts, the corporate pressure was secondary to the intense crackling tension between them. Observers, crew members, and the show's creators immediately noticed the shift in the atmosphere. The chemistry was not a manufactured product of the writing room. It was palpable, raw, and entirely genuine. They were actively courting one another in real time, under the blinding heat of the studio lights. The script they were required to perform was a psychological minefield. The writers had crafted a storyline that unintentionally mirrored the exact power dynamics and underlying insecurities of their real-world relationship. Roberts was cast as Susie Moss, a former classmate of Chandler Bing. The narrative established that during their childhood, Chandler had publicly humiliated Susie by pulling up her skirt in front of an entire auditorium. Susie returns decades later, masquerading as a romantic interest, solely to execute a ruthless, premeditated revenge. The climax of the episode requires Susie to charm Chandler in a restaurant bathroom. She convinces him to remove all of his clothing, leaving him wearing only her personal garments. She then steals his clothes and abandons him in the bathroom stall, forcing him to face the public entirely deprived of his dignity. When analyzing this scene through the lens of their real-life dynamic, the parallels are staggering. On screen, Perry's character is physically left completely unclothed, rendered entirely vulnerable and powerless by a woman who holds all the control. Off-screen, Perry felt exactly the same way. He was completely exposed. He was a television sitcom actor standing next to a $20 million movie star. His defense mechanisms, his sarcasm, his carefully curated jokes were useless against her genuine affection. The script required Chandler to submit to Susie's power, and in reality, Perry felt he was entirely subordinate to Roberts' monumental status. The studio audience of 300 people roared with laughter at the comedic timing, completely unaware that they were watching a man act out his deepest, most paralyzing psychological fear of inadequacy. The episode, titled "The One After the Super Bowl," aired in January 1996. The network's billion-dollar gamble paid off flawlessly. The broadcast drew an astonishing 52.9 million viewers, cementing Friends as a permanent fixture in American cultural history. It was a massive, unprecedented victory for the television network. But for Matthew Perry and Julia Roberts, the broadcast marked the violent end of their private sanctuary. Hollywood does not allow privacy, it monetizes it. The moment the episode aired, the media apparatus connected the dots. The undeniable on-screen chemistry translated into real-world confirmation. The paparazzi descended upon them with military precision. The relationship that had been nurtured in the quiet transatlantic hum of fax machines was instantly dragged into the brutal, unforgiving light of the mid-1990s tabloid culture. Their faces were aggressively plastered across the front pages of every supermarket magazine. Photographers camped outside their residences, tracked their vehicles, and documented their private dinners. For Roberts, this level of surveillance was a grim, familiar reality. She had spent years navigating the aggressive tactics of the global press. She knew how to build a psychological fortress against the flashbulbs. She remained grounded, focusing entirely on the man she was dating, effectively ignoring the chaos surrounding them. But for Perry, the sudden, extreme escalation of public scrutiny was catastrophic. He was accustomed to the controlled, highly managed environment of a television set. The tabloid attention amplified his developing paranoia to unmanageable levels. Every time a photographer shouted their names, it reinforced his internal narrative. The cameras were not there for Matthew Perry, the actor. They were there for Julia Roberts, the cinematic monarch, and the television comedian who was inexplicably allowed to stand next to her. The Hollywood caste system is rigid, and it does not forgive those who attempt to cross its boundaries. The intense media spotlight exacerbated the deep financial and status disparity between them. Perry was earning tens of thousands of dollars a week. Roberts was earning more than the entire operating budget of a television season for a single film. This was not a matter of petty jealousy. It was a matter of fundamental, crippling insecurity. He looked at the woman beside him, analyzing her wealth, her power, and her global adoration, and his childhood abandonment schema was triggered with devastating force. He became absolutely convinced that she was evaluating him, discovering his flaws, and preparing to leave him. He believed it was a mathematical certainty. Why would the most beautiful, powerful woman in the entertainment industry settle for a broken, insecure man who was terrified of his own shadow? What Roberts could not see, and what the paparazzi cameras failed to capture, was that Perry's psychological collapse was being rapidly accelerated by a hidden, highly destructive catalyst. The insecurity was tearing at his mind, but his central nervous system was already under the total control of a chemical master. While he was holding the hand of the woman he loved, smiling for the cameras and riding the wave of historic television ratings, Matthew Perry was actively fighting a severe silent war against prescription opiates. The invisible third wheel in their relationship was about to take the wheel entirely, steering the greatest romance of his life directly off a cliff. The public consumed the photographic evidence of a Hollywood fairy tale, completely blind to the biochemical nightmare unraveling just beneath the surface. To the outside observer, Matthew Perry had conquered the world. He was the star of the most successful television program of the decade, and he had secured the romantic affection of the most highly sought-after woman on the planet. But the human brain does not process reality based on Nielsen ratings or tabloid covers. It processes reality through neurochemistry. While Perry was navigating the intense, highly scrutinized early stages of his relationship with Julia Roberts, his central nervous system was already under the absolute dictatorial control of prescription opiates and alcohol. The addiction was not a recreational indulgence. It was a desperate, fatalistic coping mechanism. The crushing weight of his imposter syndrome, exacerbated by the relentless demands of the network television machine and the sheer magnitude of Roberts' fame, required a chemical buffer. He found that buffer in Vicodin. The pills provided a synthetic warm blanket over his constant vibrating anxiety. They silenced the childhood voice that told him he was an unaccompanied minor destined for abandonment. But the biological cost of this silence was absolute emotional paralysis. To understand the tragedy of their relationship, one must understand the clinical reality of anhedonia, a primary symptom of severe opiate addiction. When a human being routinely floods their system with artificial dopamine through narcotics, the brain shuts down its natural production of the chemical. The neural pathways required to feel genuine pleasure, warmth, and romantic connection are structurally, effectively disabled. This is the cruelest irony of Perry's existence during this period. He had acquired everything he had ever desired. He was holding the hand of a woman who was fiercely intelligent, staggeringly beautiful, and genuinely invested in his well-being. But biologically, he was physically incapable of experiencing the joy of that reality. The drugs had hijacked his nervous system. He was a man starving to death at a banquet, entirely unable to digest the affection she was offering. Maintaining this facade required a staggering, unsustainable expenditure of psychological energy. Perry was forced to live 3 distinct, entirely incompatible lives simultaneously. During the day, he was required to be Chandler Bing, the energetic, perfectly timed comedic engine for the NBC network. In the evenings, he was the charming, intellectual equal to a cinematic titan, navigating high society dinners and blinding paparazzi flashbulbs. But in the quiet, desperate moments in between, he was a sweating, terrified addict, meticulously counting pills in his pockets and calculating exactly how much alcohol he could consume before his speech began to slur. The physical exhaustion of this daily deception was immense, but the moral exhaustion was far worse. Every time Roberts looked at him with genuine admiration, the guilt compounded. She was falling in love with an illusion. She was engaging with a man who was actively disappearing behind a chemical wall. From Robert's perspective, the dynamic looked entirely different. She had spent the first half of the 1990s as the ultimate prize in the Hollywood caste system. She had dated leading men and navigated the aggressive, often predatory egos of the film industry. She was acutely aware that many men sought her company merely to leverage her power or stroke their own vanity. What she found in Perry was a profound relief. He was self-deprecating. He did not attempt to dominate the room with aggressive masculine posturing. He engaged her mind, challenged her intellect over fax machines, and made her laugh in a way that stripped away the suffocating armor of her fame. Roberts mistook his internal distance for the natural sensitivity of a brilliant, artistic mind. She saw a man who was slightly overwhelmed by the circus of their public lives, and she interpreted his vulnerability as a deeply attractive contrast to the arrogance she normally encountered. She had no framework to understand that his vulnerability was not just emotional, it was a symptom of a systemic chemical collapse. She offered him a safe harbor, completely unaware that the ship she was guiding in was already sinking. In an effort to solidify their connection and escape the relentless surveillance of Los Angeles, Roberts orchestrated a deeply significant shift in their environment. As the calendar turned toward the end of 1995, preparing to ring in the new year, she invited Perry to her private family home in Taos, New Mexico. This invitation was not a standard Hollywood holiday retreat to a luxury resort. It was a profound gesture of intimacy and trust. Taos is a high-altitude, deeply quiet town, famous for its stark natural beauty and indigenous history. It is the absolute geographical and cultural antithesis of a Warner Brothers soundstage. By bringing him to Taos, Roberts was deliberately stripping away the artificial infrastructure of their lives. There were no publicists, no screaming studio audiences, and no paparazzi hiding in the shrubbery. She was pulling him out of the celebrity ecosystem and integrating him directly into her grounded, familial reality. She introduced him to her mother and her siblings, welcoming him into the private, fiercely guarded center of her life. The transition was a psychological shock to Perry's system. In the freezing, snow-covered isolation of northern New Mexico, the constant, distracting noise of his career evaporated. On a sound stage, he could rely on the laughter of 300 people to validate his existence. In a Los Angeles restaurant, he could rely on his quick wit to deflect any moment of genuine emotional exposure. But in the quiet, adobe living room of the Roberts family home, those defense mechanisms were useless. He was not required to perform. He was only required to be present. For a man carrying a severe abandonment schema and a hidden addiction, being truly present is the ultimate terror. The snow globe isolation of Taos forced him to be entirely alone with his own internal monologue. There was nowhere to hide. As they sat together in the warmth of her family home, the contrast between her reality and his internal decay became agonizingly clear. Robert's family was normal, welcoming, and entirely unimpressed by the Hollywood machinery. They accepted him not as a famous television star, but simply as the man who was making Julia happy. They offered him a glimpse of a quiet, stable life, the exact type of familial security he had craved, since he was a child shuffling between Ottawa and California. But instead of feeling victorious, Perry felt like a disgusting fraud. He sat on the sofa, feeling the pills burning a hole in his pocket. He looked at the woman who had trusted him enough to bring him into her sanctuary, and his mind twisted that trust into a brutal indictment. He firmly believed he was deceiving a fundamentally good person. The addiction amplified his deepest insecurities, whispering that he was a broken, toxic entity infecting a healthy family. The warmth of the Taos environment did not thaw his anxiety. It crystallized his paranoia. He was absolutely convinced that the longer he stayed, the closer she would look. And if she looked closely enough, past the jokes and the charming fax messages, she would inevitably see the hollow, terrified addict underneath. In Perry's damaged psychological framework, it was a mathematical certainty that she would eventually realize he was fundamentally unworthy of her love. And when she did, the abandonment would destroy him completely. Sitting in the quiet snow of New Mexico, surrounded by everything he had ever wanted, the agonizing burden of waiting for the inevitable rejection became too heavy to carry. To survive the terror of being abandoned, his mind began to formulate a cold, desperate, and devastating strategy. The return journey from the quiet snowscapes of Taos to the concrete sprawl of Los Angeles marked the beginning of the end. For Julia Roberts, the holiday had been a definitive success. She had successfully extracted the man she cared for from the toxic, sycophantic machinery of Hollywood and introduced him to her foundational reality. She had exposed her vulnerabilities, allowing Perry to see past the intimidating $20 million movie star to the grounded woman underneath. She returned to California ready to deepen the relationship, operating under the entirely reasonable assumption that they were building a genuine, mature partnership based on mutual intellectual respect and emotional trust. But for Matthew Perry, the return to Los Angeles was a return to the gallows. The trip to New Mexico had not cured his insecurities. It had weaponized them. He had looked directly at the normal, loving life Roberts was offering, and his chemically altered brain had violently rejected it. To understand the mechanics of his subsequent actions, one must look past the superficial narrative of a Hollywood romance and analyze his behavior through the strict clinical lens of criminal and behavioral psychology. Perry was operating under a severe, deeply ingrained abandonment schema. This is a specific psychological framework forged in early childhood trauma. When a child, like the young Perry, flying alone between separated parents in Ottawa and California, learns that love is conditional and that the people who are supposed to provide safety can inexplicably vanish, the brain adapts. It creates a defense mechanism. The adult carrying this schema lives in a state of permanent, agonizing anticipation of being left behind. They believe that rejection is not just a possibility, but a mathematical certainty. When an individual with a severe abandonment schema is confronted with genuine, unconditional love, they do not feel relief. They feel terror. The anxiety of waiting for the other person to discover their flaws and leave becomes a suffocating, unbearable weight. To escape this psychological torture, the individual utilizes a destructive tactic known as the preemptive strike. Rather than living in the agonizing terror of waiting to be abandoned, they destroy the relationship themselves. By pulling the trigger, they seize control of the timeline. They guarantee their own heartbreak, but they eliminate the unbearable anxiety of waiting for the axe to fall. In early 1996, after just 2 intense, highly publicized months of dating, the psychological burden finally crushed Perry. He looked at Roberts, radiant, successful, and entirely committed to him, and he made a cold, calculated decision to end his own panic. He initiated the breakup. The execution of this breakup was abrupt and devastating. He did not sit down with Roberts to explain his addiction. He did not confess his crippling imposter syndrome or ask for her help to navigate the overwhelming pressure of their disparate levels of fame. To do so would have required a level of emotional honesty that he was entirely incapable of accessing. Instead, he simply pulled the ripcord. He ended the relationship with the sterile efficiency of a man severing a corporate contract, citing the overwhelming pressure and a vague incompatibility that he could not properly articulate. Julia Roberts was left entirely bewildered, stunned, and deeply hurt. Her confusion was absolute, and it was entirely justified. She had approached the relationship with genuine intentions. She had navigated the bizarre intellectual courtship over the fax machines. She had braved the aggressive paparazzi scrutiny, and she had opened the doors of her private family home to him. She was the most famous woman on the planet, a woman who could have commanded the attention of any man in the industry. Yet she had chosen the self-deprecating television comedian because she believed in the profound connection of their minds. Now she was being abruptly discarded, and she had absolutely no logical framework to understand why. She was completely unaware that his mind had been hijacked by severe insecurity and chemical dependency. Perry had utilized the vast wealth and resources provided by the television network to perfectly conceal his Vicodin addiction from her. Roberts thought she was dating a brilliant, slightly neurotic actor. She did not know she was dating a man whose central nervous system was shutting down. She was heavily penalized for a war that was happening entirely inside his head. The cruelty of this situation was vastly compounded by the Hollywood system that surrounded them. The entertainment industry operates with the cold, ruthless efficiency of an abattoir. It does not care about the emotional wreckage of the human beings who generate its revenue. NBC had already extracted exactly what it needed from their romance. The Super Bowl episode had aired. The network had secured its record-breaking 52.9 million viewers. The syndication contracts had been signed, guaranteeing billions of dollars in future profits. The corporate objective was complete. Once the ratings were secured, the PR machine immediately lost interest in protecting either of them. The system that had eagerly commodified their private affection now entirely ignored their separate agonies. The studio executives did not offer Perry psychiatric support or addiction intervention. They simply handed him his script for the next episode and ordered him back onto stage 24 to make America laugh. As long as he hit his marks and delivered his punchlines, the network was perfectly content to look the other way while his internal organs failed. For Roberts, the machine was equally unfeeling. The industry did not allow her the time or the privacy to process the bizarre sudden rejection. She was immediately pushed into the production schedules of her next global blockbusters. She was required to step back in front of the cameras, project the trademark megawatt smile that justified her $20 million salary, and pretend that the abrupt end of her relationship was merely a minor logistical inconvenience. The systemic isolation of her fame made it impossible for her to seek clarity. in the highest echelons of Hollywood, surrounded by publicists, managers, and yes men whose livelihoods depended on her box office returns. Roberts had no one who could objectively explain the behavior of the man who had just left her. The industry insulated her so heavily that it blinded her to the reality of his addiction. She was left to carry the sting of an inexplicable rejection, forced to assume that despite her immense success and her genuine efforts, she had somehow not been enough to hold his attention. The preemptive strike had been successfully executed. Matthew Perry had successfully protected himself from the hypothetical terror of being dumped by Julia Roberts. But the cost of this defensive maneuver was catastrophic. He had secured his isolation, returning to his empty house in Los Angeles with nothing but his rapidly escalating addiction to keep him company. He had actively destroyed the single greatest romantic opportunity of his life, trading the genuine, grounded love of an intellectual equal for the cold synthetic comfort of prescription opiates. Their paths, which had briefly and violently collided under the blinding lights of a television soundstage, now completely severed. They walked away from each other and stepped back into the meat grinder of the late 1990s entertainment industry. But the true devastating contrast of the choice Perry made that day would not become fully visible to the world until exactly 5 years later, playing out on live television in front of a global audience of hundreds of millions. The consequences of a psychological preemptive strike are rarely immediate. The initial sensation is often a deceptive, hollow relief. The anxiety of waiting for the relationship to fail is eliminated, replaced by the familiar, controllable ache of a self-inflicted wound. But the true devastating cost of Matthew Perry's decision to abandon Julia Roberts took exactly 5 years to fully manifest. The stark reality of their diverging paths was illuminated with brutal clarity on the night of March 25th, 2001. On that evening, Julia Roberts stood on the stage of the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. She was wearing a vintage black and white Valentino gown, gripping the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance in Erin Brockovich. This was not merely a trophy. It was the ultimate, undeniable validation of her entire existence within the Hollywood caste system. For a decade, the industry had attempted to reduce her to a highly profitable megawatt smile. They had weaponized her personal life to sell tabloids and treated her as a commercial commodity rather than a serious artist. But on that stage, looking out at a room full of the most powerful executives in the world, she was invincible. She had forced the cinematic establishment to acknowledge her raw, dramatic talent. She was at the absolute, untouchable zenith of her profession. At that exact moment, miles away from the glamour of the Shrine Auditorium, Matthew Perry was sitting in a completely different institutional setting. He was confined within the sterile, heavily monitored walls of a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center. He was not wearing a tailored tuxedo. He was sweating through the violent physical agony of chemical withdrawal. Sitting on a cheap chair in a common room, he stared at a small television screen and watched the woman he had pushed away accept the highest honor in the film industry. The contrast between the two screens, the global broadcast of her triumph and the grim private reality of his physical decay, was a staggering indictment of the choices dictated by his trauma. He had successfully protected himself from the hypothetical fear of her rejecting him. He had maintained control, but the prize for that control was absolute, terrifying isolation. He had traded a genuine partnership with an intellectual equal for a prison cell built entirely out of prescription narcotics. To understand how Perry ended up in that chair, one must examine the ruthless complicity of the television network that employed him. Between the breakup in 1996 and his institutionalization in 2001, Perry's addiction had spiraled into a life-threatening crisis. He was consuming massive, lethal quantities of Vicodin, methadone, and alcohol. His physical appearance fluctuated wildly on screen, a visual documentation of his internal organ failure. Yet, the Hollywood machinery did not halt. The executives at NBC did not intervene when he arrived on set sweating and trembling. They intervened only when his physical deterioration directly threatened the production schedule of their billion-dollar asset. The entertainment system operates with a psychopathic focus on the bottom line. The executives had eagerly engineered the Super Bowl romance to boost ratings, capitalizing on his chemistry with Roberts. When the relationship ended and Perry's addiction escalated, they looked the other way. The network effectively enabled his chemical dependency by consistently rewarding him with massive paychecks and global adoration, so long as he continued to deliver the comedic punchlines that kept the advertising revenue flowing. Perry was not treated as a sick human being who needed emergency medical intervention. He was treated as a highly expensive piece of heavy machinery. They only sent the machine to the repair shop when it completely broke down and threatened the syndication profits. While Perry fought a desperate, gruesome war against his own biology, Roberts navigated the ensuing years by building an ironclad fortress around her private life. She had learned a brutal lesson from the intense, highly publicized failure of her mid-1990s relationships. The sudden, inexplicable rejection by Perry had reinforced the danger of exposing her vulnerability to a public that only wanted to consume her drama. She eventually found the grounded, stable reality she had initially offered Perry in Taos, but she built it with someone else. She married a cinematographer, a man who worked behind the camera rather than in front of it. She stepped back from the relentless glare of the Hollywood spotlight, relocating her family away from Los Angeles to protect her children from the predatory paparazzi apparatus that had previously defined her existence. She survived the industry by actively refusing to participate in its toxic demands for her privacy. For over 2 decades, the true narrative of their 1996 romance remained entirely buried. The entertainment media moved on to new targets. The Super Bowl episode of Friends was placed into heavy, permanent syndication, playing on continuous loops in living rooms across the globe. Audiences continued to laugh at the impeccable comedic timing of Susie Underpants and Chandler Bing, completely ignorant of the profound psychological tragedy that had occurred the moment the cameras stopped rolling. The silence was finally broken in November 2022. Matthew Perry published his memoir, Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing. In an industry defined by spin, aggressive public relations, and carefully curated memoirs designed to protect brands, Perry did something unprecedented. He stripped away all the Hollywood mythology and delivered a blunt, unvarnished confession. He publicly documented the severe mechanics of his addiction, and for the first time, revealed the exact psychological reasons behind his abrupt breakup with Julia Roberts. He wrote with the heavy, tragic clarity of a man who had survived a war but lost everything that mattered in the process. He admitted that breaking up with her was one of the most agonizing, foolish mistakes of his life. He laid the blame entirely on his own damaged architecture. He confessed that his imposter syndrome and his chemical dependency had convinced him he was broken, inadequate, and destined to be discarded. He explained the preemptive strike. For Julia Roberts, reading those words decades later must have been an experience of profound, complex grief. For 26 years, she had been left to wonder why her affection, her intellect, and her genuine efforts to integrate him into her family had not been enough. She had been forced to carry the sting of an inexplicable rejection. Perry's memoir finally provided the closure that the Hollywood PR machine had denied her. It completely exonerated her. She learned undeniably that she was not discarded because she lacked value. She was abandoned precisely because she possessed too much of it. She was terrifying to a man who did not believe he deserved to be safe. It was a tragic retrospective vindication. She was penalized not for her actions, but because she had unknowingly walked into the blast radius of his childhood trauma and his terminal disease. The intersection of Matthew Perry and Julia Roberts remains one of the most sobering, indicting chapters in the history of modern celebrity. It is a story that aggressively dismantles the illusion of the Hollywood fairy tale. The NBC network engineered their collision for a singular purpose: corporate profit. The executives capitalized on a genuine, vulnerable human connection, broadcast it to 52 million people to secure a financial empire, and then entirely abandoned the human beings involved when the psychological collateral damage became inconvenient. Their story exposes the devastating limitations of external success. In 1996, they possessed everything the culture defines as valuable: unparalleled wealth, global fame, historical physical beauty, and brilliant compatible intellects. They had the resources to build an extraordinary life. Yet all of that power was instantly neutralized by the invisible, corrosive force of unhealed trauma. The tragedy of Matthew Perry is a permanent warning about the lethal nature of imposter syndrome within a capitalistic system that rewards performance over authenticity. He was a brilliant man who was paid millions of dollars to mask his pain with a joke. He fundamentally believed that if he stopped performing, he would be abandoned. That fear drove him to destroy the greatest romance of his life and drove him into the arms of an addiction that would violently dictate the rest of his existence. Julia Roberts survived because she recognized the toxicity of the machine and built a wall to keep it out. Matthew Perry succumbed because he mistakenly believed he was the machine. We continue to watch the reruns, laughing at the punchlines, entirely complicit in an ecosystem that demands our entertainers sacrifice their sanity for our comfort. The Super Bowl episode stands as a digital monument to a beautiful, fleeting connection, a love story meticulously captured on film and then slowly, quietly crushed to death by the exact same industry that created it.